In this lecture, we're thinking about how modernist styles appear in Russia in the early 20th century. Russia at this time is under major political upheaval, and so the context for these designs is radically different from what we've been looking at in Western Europe. And so our major question is, how are they going to integrate these modernist styles within the communist context? The answer to this is constructivism. This is an artistic movement that's dedicated to promoting the Bolshevik government. So these constructivist artists, they see the revolution as an opportunity to create a revolutionary visual identity for the nascent communist utopia. And you should notice here that there is a return to these utopian ideals that have been playing out across everything we've looked at in the post-war era. And it's happening here too. So in Russia, they had a modernist movement, suprematism, which we just learned about. The constructivists are deeply inspired by the visuals of suprematism, but they reject all of the self-expression and emotional energy of it. So they do not think of themselves as artists. They call themselves engineers or constructors. And within this context, graphic designers have the exalted status. So painting, sculpture, all of the things that were important before, within the communist society, they say that stuff doesn't matter, and what's most important is graphic design. They're also deeply committed to industrial materials, which should remind you of the machine aesthetic, which we were talking about earlier. And then finally, they sometimes call themselves productivists because of their desire to make works that served a practical purpose within the context of the communist cause. The first artist we're going to talk about is Vladimir Tatlin. For him, he sees art as directly tied to the industrial world, and artists should approach their work with the logical planning of an engineer. Now, he's familiar with Malevich and suprematism, and he thinks it's too emotional. He wants to produce artworks that are non-objective, meaning that they don't have a subject matter, and that they use materials from the industrial world. This is an example of the type of object that Tatlin wanted to create. This is a sculpture, you could say. It is a corner counter relief. So it's meant to be hung in the corner of a room. And what he's interested in is using industrial materials to create three-dimensional form. So the materials here, no longer is it plaster or marble or anything that's associated with fine art, but rather wood and string and steel and materials that honestly look like he picked them out of the trash. What's remarkable about these objects, though, especially if you've studied three-dimensional design, is it's quite challenging to produce an object that will hang between the corners of a wall like this. And what Tatlin argues is that in studying the material properties of these industrial materials, constructivists will be able to contribute to the new society because they will be able to create more effective industrial objects. I think it's interesting to look at this next to the Malevich suprematist composition because there's a lot that's similar, right? They have the same angle, the same sort of dynamic energy. Yet the difference is Malevich has a subject matter, right? It's called plane flying, and it's supposed to be energetic and like make you feel excited. Whereas the counter relief is very much about practicality and the use of materials. Now, what's fascinating is Tatlin is doing this at the same time as Malevich, right? The corner relief is around 1915, and that's the same time as the suprematist composition plane flying. And yet you can see that Tatlin is already anticipating where things are going to go in Russian society by emphasizing the practicality of these materials and the potential to use them in many other venues. By 1919, artists like Tatlin were fully embraced by the Communist Party. However, they were concerned that these counter reliefs were too abstract and not practical enough. And so they encouraged Tatlin to focus more on things that could actually be produced. And so what we're looking at here is a building that Tatlin designed called the Monument to the Third International. The Third International is a communist organization that was dedicated to the spread of communism around the world. This was meant to be an office building that would house all of the workers that are part of the Third International. It was never actually built. It was supposed to be 1,300 feet tall. And then within the center of this, you can see that there are 3 blocks. So this is a rectangular block, a triangular one on top of it, and then a cylindrical block at the top. And these were supposed to house 3 different types of offices within the organization. So the lowest level was supposed to hold the legislature, the pyramid on the second level was supposed to hold the executive branch, and the uppermost cylinder would contain the propaganda ministry. Then surrounding the entire thing is this skeletal steel frame that creates this really dynamic motion. So what we're looking at here is a 22-foot model that was exhibited in Moscow. Not many people saw it. More people saw this poster by Nikolai Punin, and I find the poster makes it a little bit easier to visualize it as well because you can clearly see the blocks in here. The next artist I want to talk about is Alexander Rodchenko. He was a painter. He was self-taught just by looking at magazines until he joins the Stroganov Institute in 1915, where under the influence of Malevich, he creates abstract paintings. However, he abandons painting in 1921 because he sees it as being impractical. He wants to serve the Communist Party, and so he focuses on artwork that will achieve its goals. So he forms an advertising firm that he calls Ad Constructor in 1923 with the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. And they work together to create advertising campaigns for state industries. So we're going to look at a couple of the posters that he designs for these industries. This one is Dobrolay. This is the state-run airplane producer. And at this point, the Soviet Union is way behind the rest of the world in terms of their industrial production. And so there's this push to have the public support and fund the industrialization of the Soviet Union, including creating their own air fleets. So Dobrolay is the state-run airline industry, and you were supposed to invest in it. So this is a poster encouraging you to invest. And what it basically says is, shame on you, your name is not yet on the list of Dobrolay stockholders. The whole country follows the list. So if you aren't on the list and you're not supporting the state, everyone's going to know. So let's talk about how this works. There is an image here, right? It's a plane. And notice it's in almost the same pose as that suprematist composition by Malevich. But then the rest of it is very geometric. There's an arrow pointing to the propeller, and then you can go follow this around the entire frame of the image to a giant exclamation point. And so what's wonderful about these is they're so dynamic. The way that Rodchenko, he takes the dynamism of suprematism, but then he makes it very practical in order to achieve his goals. Here's another example. This is for state-produced cocoa. And the text says, "Comrades, don't argue. Soviet citizens will become stronger in sport. In our might is our right, and where is strength? In this cocoa." Now, all this text is written by the poet Mayakovsky, but it's Rodchenko who combines these geometric forms to create a really engaging object. All right, so in the center, we see the can of cocoa, and that looks exactly like the can would be on the shelf. But he embeds it within this trapezoidal frame, and then again with the arrows, right? So the arrows pointing to the object in the same way the arrows pointed to the plane. I also like how it sort of looks like arms, like it reads like a person flexing, and that's where it says, "In our might is our right." And so you get the sense that these arrows become the Soviet Union flexing their muscles. Now, Russian constructivism is very much ideologically driven. However, the solutions that they develop end up moving across the continent. And the person who's responsible for this is L. Lissitzky. We already talked about him briefly in the suprematist lecture. He's the one that made that poster, beat the whites with the red wedge. El Lissitzky is fluent in German, and he travels frequently throughout the continent, and he lectures on constructivism. He even organizes traveling exhibitions of constructivist work. And what he ultimately ends up promoting is this type of international constructivism, which is far more politically neutral and related to geometric abstraction. So let's first look at a work that El Lissitzky produces. This is a photo montage. Photo montages were very important to the Russian constructivists. We didn't get to look at any by Rodchenko, but if you ever study the history of photography, you'll definitely be looking at Rodchenko's photographic work as well. Anyway, El Lissitzky's work here is a photograph of him with a hand superimposed on top of it. You can see it right here. So that's his hand, and he's holding a compass, which he's using to produce this perfect circle that goes behind his head. We see arrows, we see typeface that looks like it's made with a stencil, and there's a grid behind him too. So all of these choices suggest engineering and mathematical precision more than art making. However, I love that he puts his hand over his eye as if to suggest that it is his mind who controls his hand that produces these images. And the production of a circle like that right behind his head, it actually evokes a self-portrait by Rembrandt. So even as much as they're trying to reject that bourgeois tradition, you still see it coming in here. So this is the fairly radical photo montage that he produces. It becomes the basis for an ad that he produces for Pelikan, a German ink manufacturer. So this is a great example of how constructivist principles can kind of be neutralized in order to serve capitalist aims. So on the left, you can see that El Lissitzky literally takes the hand holding the compass and the circle, and instead of it being a photo montage, it is now an illustration, and you have the bottle of ink in his hand. And it achieves a similar effect. I mean, in some ways, when you look at this, it should sort of make you think of Sachplakat, and it is Germany, after all, where this is being advertised. But it stems from his work as a constructivist. The last image I will leave you with is this brilliant poster of a Russian exhibition that El Lissitzky curates that goes to Zurich. So this is an exhibit of constructivist work that was on display in the Museum of Applied Arts in Zurich in 1929. And it's a photo montage again, right? But what he's done here is he's taken a photo montage of two Russian youths and kind of blends them together. It's meant to demonstrate the equality of gender in the new Soviet Union. It ends up looking kind of creepy though. I mean, I think it's fabulously creepy, but you know, you might have a different idea. I also really like, so this is a photograph of a building, and he superimposes the text at the same angle as if it's an angle, or as if it's a banner going across the building. And so he really is integrating text and image in a sophisticated way that should remind you of the Rodchenko and the way that they integrate geometric forms, text, and photographs in order to communicate their message.